Well, welcome everyone to the virtual world of the Eastside Freedom Library. We're delighted to be working with our friends in the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League in organizing this program for this evening. I'm going to turn you over to Vinny Taguchi, who is the president of the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League. And he's going to walk us through the ground rules and introduce our speakers. We're delighted to have ASL interpreters with us this evening. So we're going to try to speak slowly so as not to make their lives too difficult. And when you get an opportunity to speak, we hope you'll remember their presence and their work as well. So, Vinny, we're in your hands.
All right, thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. My name is Vinny Taguchi. I have the honor of serving as the current president of the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. We have a very exciting program tonight. We're going to be learning about the history of the American with Disabilities Act and the history of disabilities in the Japanese American community in general. It's kind of a rich history that we don't get to hear about too often. And we'll get to be hearing a lot of it from our resident scholar, Selena Moon, as well as different perspectives from our esteemed panelists following the presentation. So over the course of the program, if you could remember to keep your video off, that will allow it so that it doesn't come up in the recording. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you. And then please feel free to put any questions in the chat and we'll get to those after. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Selena Moon, who is a Japanese American historian and writer who researches and writes about Japanese American mixed race and disability history. She is writing a middle grade and picture book about disabled Japanese American children in the World War II incarceration camps, which began during her Loft Literary Center Mirrors and Windows Fellowship in 2020. She received her BA from Smith College and MA from University of Massachusetts Amherst. Through her work with the Free Thinking Abolitionists Interpreting Racism, FAIR Collective, which is creating a traveling exhibit to teach children about racism, the Disabled Academic Collective, DAC, and several committees, she is working to make the world a just, safe place for all. Well, take it away, Selena.
All right, and I actually remember to unmute this time. Let's see if this works. And all right. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our lovely interpreters today. Some of you may have been here during my last presentation on mixed race Japanese American history, and so there might be a little bit of repetition from that. Today's presentation will be on Japanese American disability history. And how did I get here? Well, let's see. Oops. There we go. So I was in college and I took a course on literature written by Japanese American incarcerees and started looking at mixed race Japanese American history. And during my college reunion several years later, that professor explained that Asian American disability history was becoming a topic of interest among historians. And so several years later, I visited Manzanar, the incarceration camp in California, and saw the picture on the right, which was a table with information about education for disabled children at Manzanar incarceration camp. and got really interested in disability in the camps and started my research from there, and have expanded to include Japanese American disability history as a whole. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of information yet, partly because I don't have access to the sources. So I'm hoping to do that over the next few years and get out to all the archives that I need to. So as far as I can tell, Japanese American disability history takes a little bit to start. Japanese American immigration started in 1868 in Hawaii with sugar plantation workers, and to the mainland in 1869, and 1880s and 90s migration to Alaska. But I haven't found any disabled people during that time period yet. The first disabled person in Hawaii related to the sugar plantations and accidents during their work occurs in 1920. So I'm assuming there are disabled people in the earlier histories, but I haven't found any yet. So hoping to fill that gap at some point. And the book that I actually found the disabled sugar plantation workers is on the right here. The Japanese Conspiracy, the Oahu Sugar Strike of 1920. Unfortunately, there's really no detail about their condition. So the first examples of disabled Japanese Americans occurs in the 1890s. And so Nobuteru Harry Sumida, who came up in my mixed race presentation from last time, was born in New York around 1870. He was, as far as I can tell, the first second generation Japanese American born on the East Coast. And then he, oops, I got my dates mixed up. So in the 1880s, he enlisted in the US Navy, and in 1881 fought in the Spanish-American War. He may have been the only second generation Japanese American combatant, and he suffered a leg injury, and that permanently disabled him. And in 1904, he married a white woman named Joanna Schmidt, and the couple lived in New York until they moved to California around 1940. More on him shortly. And here's a picture of him on the right, taken in 1942 by the photographer Ansel Adams while he was in the incarceration camp, Manzanar. So at the same time that Harry was becoming a disabled veteran, there was the first example of a deaf Japanese American. So Mary was born in Washington in 1887, and I'm not sure if she was born deaf, but she and her family moved to California, possibly to enroll Mary in the California School for the Deaf and Blind, although Washington had a school at that time, so maybe that's not why. And she's in the census records once as a CSD student and once at home in the 1900 census, about a 1 week gap in between. So I'm assuming she finished school for the year and then went home. And she appears, interestingly, in a California newspaper article in 1904 about CSD. And it was explaining about the students there. And she was actually the only student in the article who was named. And it was specifically pointed out that she was a Japanese American. And here's a bit of a clip from the newspaper article on the right. The author was explaining that he was watching Mary and her classmates asking and answering questions about newspapers in California, writing the answers and questions back and forth to each other. And in 1907, she received a diploma and an honorable dismissal certificate, which specifically stated that she could return at any point to finish her education. So I'm not sure if she actually graduated, and then she completely disappears from the historical record, unfortunately. And then so the first instance of somebody with multiple disabilities is Kikue Ukai, Ukai is her surname. And she was born able-bodied, but became deaf in both ears and blind in one eye after a roller skating accident as a child. And she enrolled at the California School for the Deaf and Blind sometime probably before 1920. And then a couple of years later, the California School for the Deaf and the California School for the Blind split. And she graduated, I think about 1923, there's a bit of a discrepancy, and went on to Gallaudet, which is the only liberal arts college for deaf and hard of hearing people in the United States. And she was, as far as I can tell, again, the first Japanese American student at Gallaudet. And she was there for several years until 1928, when she left without graduating. And I found a note in her file that says she went back possibly to the California School for the Deaf. And after that, she started writing for various Japanese American newspapers simultaneously. And then by 1936, had her own column called Literary Bypaths in the New World Sun. And she would critique literature, much of which I found very dry and boring. So I'm not quite sure how she managed to do all of that. And so here's a picture of Kikue on the right. She's the second student from the right, fourth row from the bottom. So sorry, this is all hard to see. And so here's a copy of her column, The New World Sun, the Literary Bypaths. It was always on the front page of the newspaper. And it was a very popular column. A lot of other people would comment about it and write very nice things about her column. And so, interestingly, I have heard through Japanese Americans who I've spoken with now and through my research that Japanese Americans and Asian Americans in general, families would typically hide their disabled children because of the stigma associated with disability, but I really haven't found that to be the case. The families would send them to school. They would, if the child was deaf, attempt to learn sign language with varying degrees of success. They would send them to classes for physically disabled children and so forth. So there really wasn't this stigma against disability as much as I've heard of. And so in the 1920s and 30s, there were more and more deaf Japanese Americans at CSD. And despite efforts to segregate classes between Japanese or Asian students and white students, CSD was integrated. So the census record up at the top right has Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Black, Indian, that is Native American, students all in one class. And the number held steady at about 10 Japanese American students, with everybody graduating and coming in. So between the 1930s and 40s, there were about 10, 11. And in the 1940 census, which interestingly doesn't actually have some of the students who were actually there, One of the students was Hana Takagi, who was then about 13, and more on her. She plays a very important role in Japanese American disability history. And all of the 1940 students would, their lives would be disrupted by the incarceration. And interestingly, another deaf girl, Ruth Kikuko Ichikawa, who was born in 1931 and became deaf as a child, she would be so far the only Japanese American student who I have found who went back to Japan to receive an education. Everybody else seems to have stayed in the United States. And so the bottom here is an explanation of her family situation with her parents and siblings, and explaining that Ruth went back to Japan and then came back to the United States and joined the deaf community here. I'm not sure when she came back. She does not appear to have gone to camp, so I think it might have been post-war that she returned. Okay, so on to blind students. There really weren't a lot of blind people so far in the historical record either, interestingly. So the first I have found roughly is Aiko Kuroki, who became blind due to meningitis or polio. The records differ. Around 1929 when she was 7, and her family was in Idaho at the time. So she went to the Idaho School for the Blind and learned to play the piano. And so she's, as you'll see on the top right, in the Vespers concert and several other performances while she was at the School for the Blind. And her family moved to California around 1936. And so she went to the California School for the Blind. And at the same time that she was attending there, I have another student who moved from Hawaii, Frederick Hayashi, who was born in 1919 and grew up in Hawaii, moved to Massachusetts to attend the Perkins School for the Blind. And he also learned to play the piano. And he was probably the first Japanese American student at Perkins. And he would lead a very interesting life during the war. And at the same time, there was also Tokinobu Mihara, who was born in 1897 as a second generation Japanese American. And he had glaucoma and would become blind during the incarceration. So here on the right is Frederick listed in the list of pupils for the Perkins Institute in 1939. And I'm finding a lot of lists of pupils as I do my research. So that's been very, very helpful in all of the records. So Executive Order 9066, 1942, February of 1942. All Japanese Americans and their families, that includes half Japanese, a quarter Japanese, et cetera, children, were to be incarcerated in camps. And that initially excluded totally deaf, totally blind, children in orphanages or hospitals, institutionalized, hospitalized people, except that, and I haven't figured out the background on this, that was reversed ultimately, except for tuberculosis patients and other communicable diseases and people with severe mental and physical disabilities. Everybody else was incarcerated, including students at the schools for the deaf and the blind on the West Coast. The only exception I have found is Ran Hirano, who is the only one of the 11 deaf students at CSD to be exempt. I have not figured out how his family managed this, but more information on Ron, his autobiography, My Journey Through Four Worlds, growing up in the Japanese, deaf, hearing, and American worlds is about his life at CSD and during the camp and his family's incarceration and several other students who were at school with him. And so everybody, unfortunately, now has to go to camp, and the authorities really did not think about how difficult life would be for disabled people. They had no provisions. They didn't have things like ramps for wheelchairs. They didn't have bathroom facilities except outhouses, as you'll see on the right near the hospital barracks, or latrines. They really didn't have accessible cafeterias. You had to go far away to go and eat all kinds of things. So if you wanted accommodations, the incarcerees had to build everything themselves, except for the hospital. The hospital had a ramp, but if your barrack needed a ramp, if you needed other accommodations, you had to do all of that. And unfortunately, there was also very poor medical care. There weren't a lot of facilities. There was a lack of equipment. There really weren't a lot of doctors. So there was a lot of communicable diseases, polio, German measles, AKA rubella, and other epidemics that also led to disability. And there were also people whose symptoms worsened and who became disabled. And, there was also really no facility for, say, people with mental illness, mental disability. Some of them were then sent to institutions because the camp authorities didn't know how to handle their cases. And a lot of them struggled, but a lot of them also found community because they were with blind, deaf Japanese Americans for the first time. So a few of these, I'll just lump them together because there's just very, very little information. So by 1942, Harry Sumida was widowed and he was sent to Manzanar and really celebrated as possibly the oldest Nisei at Manzanar or elsewhere, according to a March 1942 article, which also appeared in the Pacific Citizen. And it talked about his war years and his incarceration, and including the picture that Ansel Adams took. So he was very well known within the community. Poor Frederick Hayashi, who was still at Perkins at this point, is stuck on the East Coast. They wouldn't let him go home. And so he, after he finished at Perkins, went to the Moody Bible Institute and didn't go back to Hawaii until November of 1945. So he was completely alone without his family for another 3 years. And Shikue Ukai, who by then had gotten married, and her husband were sent to Santa Anita Assembly Center at the racetrack. And they were separated from her family. And then, interestingly, one of the few people to be released straight from the assembly centers, and then they went to California while the rest of her family went to camp. And so a lot of the disabled children really languished in camp. Mainstream schools were set up within months. They had impromptu graduation ceremonies in June. They started class roughly in the fall with very limited supplies and teachers. But disabled children didn't start school until about April of 1943. Manzanar was the first, and partly because schools for disabled children, say, for example, the Arkansas School for the Blind, wouldn't let Japanese students in, or the tuition was too high and the families couldn't afford it. So it wasn't until almost a year into the incarceration that they started schools for disabled children. And they would lump them all together with one teacher who really didn't have the expertise to deal with all the students. And as Hannah would later explain, it was all oralism. She wasn't allowed to use ASL to go along with the beliefs at the time that learning to speak was better than learning to sign. And so she and her family hoped that she would get a better education at Tule Lake, the other camp in California. So they moved up there. And there were 32 deaf incarcerees, about 15 children, all in her class. And right before the classes started, the teacher asked, the students to name the school. And Hannah had read about Helen Keller and suggested naming it after her. And all the students agreed. And then the teacher said, well, you should write to her. And so Hannah wrote to Helen Keller and told her about the school and about the other children there and how they were learning to speak and to navigate the world for those who were visually impaired and so forth. And the camp newspaper actually carried several articles about the school, including the letter, because, as you'll see on the right here, Helen Keller eventually replied to Hannah's letter in August of 1943. I've truncated it a little bit. It's actually about 3 pages long, but I wanted to show her signature as well. Unfortunately, by the time Helen's letter arrived, circumstances beyond everybody's control had closed the school, so it didn't last very long. And at the time, because of the military now allowing Japanese Americans to leave, the children leaving the school, going out to other locations where their parents had jobs, but as this was going on, other camps were also creating what some of them called "quote unquote" Helen Keller schools for disabled students. Some of them are more inclusive than others. Some of them mainstreamed everybody. Some of them only allowed students with certain disabilities to go to school. So really, the quality and the inclusion really depended on the school. And some of them only established the schools about a year before the incarceration ended. So some of the students really didn't go to school until 1944 or thereabouts. And on to actually, incidentally, the adults. So there were blind incarcerees in the camp, including Aiko Kuroki and Tokinobu Mihara, whose untreated glaucoma had rendered him blind shortly after he and his family arrived in camp. And Aiko taught fellow incarcerees American Braille, and Tokinobu taught Japanese Braille, which he actually reinvented. So on the right here is, on the top is his Braille board, where he had a carpenter in camp create his version of Japanese Braille. And as you'll see, there's a little bit of similarity between his version of Japanese Braille and actual Japanese Braille, but he's really redone most of the letters. And for those who don't know, there are 50 letters in the Japanese alphabet. So that's why there's so many letters on his Braille board there. So he taught his new Braille to blind Japanese Americans. And I believe some of that actually went over to Japan, but I'll have to look into that a little bit more. And again, with close quarters, there's also other disabilities. Polio epidemics, for example, led to paralysis. German measles led to blindness and deafness in babies. And tuberculosis led to amputations, and other inadequate medical care led to disability. Madeline Ota was born mentally disabled because her mother received very inadequate medical care while she was pregnant. And so in 1943, as everybody's leaving, the adults also now have a hard time reintegrating into society because some of them are disabled in camp, others can't find jobs, and all kinds of issues relating to disability equity. And the children, again, they left too, but a lot of them didn't go back to school for various reasons. Some of them, also stayed in camp and didn't have the kind of education that they needed. So some of them were lucky enough to go to school outside of camp, but a lot of them really didn't, which led to problems later on. And at the same time that everybody's in camp, there are, of course, soldiers who are being drafted from camp, and they go out to fight, and many of them become disabled. There were about 33,000 Japanese Americans in the armed forces. That includes about 6,000 who served in the military intelligence service, which would intercept Japanese American communications, translate documents, and so forth. And some of the people in the MIS were disabled people who couldn't serve in the regular military. For example, they had low vision, they had flat feet, and bad night vision, for example. And there were, of course, hundreds disabled in combat. There has yet to be an exact number. I'm guessing somewhere in the several hundreds, and I would like to find that out as well. But casualty and wounded numbers and names were printed in camp newspapers almost daily. Unfortunately, much of that really doesn't go into detail, so it's been hard to figure out, what sort of casualties, whether it's, a broken leg versus an amputation, has been very tricky to find out. And national newspapers and magazines, including Life magazine, covered disabled soldiers, mostly sort of this feel-good story of quote unquote overcoming disability, and how, wonderful it is that somebody who's severely disabled can now go back to school, or, attempt to reintegrate into society, which has its own issues. So on the right here is the Life magazine article about Yoshinao Omiya, who became blind during combat. And there are several articles in camp newspapers about him and his progress in the hospital and his recuperation, and so forth. And the post-war era was difficult for everybody. Many disabled children were so far behind their peers that they didn't go back to school. So those who did just really, really struggled. A few went off to college, but most of them just disappear into history. I haven't found a lot about most of the children. Disabled soldiers face discrimination in housing, jobs, social discrimination. The clipping on the right is an article about Kakuo Terao, another disabled soldier who was a paraplegic and had lost an arm, and he was denied housing. So that caused quite an uproar among mainstream newspapers. And other soldiers also faced job discrimination. Some of them weren't allowed to access certain services. They were kicked out of barbershops or other stores. And so there were a lot of articles about that as well. But post-war, the incarcerees and other generations have been much more open about disability, both during the war and afterwards. And part of that was for the redress movement to allow former incarcerees to get an apology from the government and monetary compensation for what they had lost during the war, which was $20,000, which was nothing compared to everything that they had lost. And especially as the first generation had mostly died by this point. So the people who had lost the most really didn't get back what they were owed. But there were many disabled government officials and others who were very involved in the redress movement. Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii was an amputee. He lost an arm in combat. Congressman Robert Matsui, he lost part of his hearing when he got sick in camp as a child. And his sister was born blind because his mother contracted German measles while she was pregnant. Congressman Spark Matsunaga was also a war veteran, and he had a leg injury. So you've got disabled veterans also supporting the redress movement. And among them, Hana Takagi testified on behalf of disabled children about the inadequate education, the inadequate social support that they received. And parents such as Mabel Olta talked about her daughter Madeline and her disability due to the conditions in the camp. And there was actually a section for disabled audience members, which I didn't find out about until a few weeks ago when I was reading the excerpt here on the bottom from When Can We Go Back to America, which was published actually last year. And so I'm learning a lot about disability, even now after everything that I've read, because it's really not a big part of Japanese American history. So in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act included an apology, compensation, and education funding. And part of that education funding was to record oral histories with former incarcerees, and to allow them to share their stories. Unfortunately, there is also very little about disability in these interviews, even when they're about disabled family members. They're also often ignored. And on to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there were several Japanese Americans involved with the ADA, support from, again, Senator Daniel Inouye, Congressman Norman Mineta, and Robert Matsui, and Justin and Yoshiko Saji Dart, and Michael Winter and Atsuko Kuwana. Atsuko has graciously agreed to participate today, who were active in getting the ADA approved and signed. Here's a picture on the right of the signing with President Bush and Justin Dart in the wheelchair and the cowboy hat. And there were others such as Representative Kip Tokuda, who after the ADA was signed, worked to make, in his case, Washington state law up to date with the ADA, ADA compliant with various accommodations and so forth. And he actually, incidentally, had a brother who was born mentally disabled because of his mother receiving inadequate care in camp as well. So there's also that connection. And lastly, so as I said earlier, the post-war generation has been a lot more vocal about disability. Whether it's the post-war generation, people with disabilities in the post-war generation, who are using their skills to talk about the incarceration and talking about their disability, or in other cases, other careers, a dancer who's deaf, a hip hop artist who uses a wheelchair, for example. But in both senses, there's still a lot of work to be done, whether it's disability inclusion in society, whether it's disability inclusion in Japanese American history, even, for example, stories about the war and the war histories really don't talk about disabled veterans at all. Maybe if it's about, say, Senator Inouye or somebody who's well known, then it might mention his disability, but there's really nothing about disabled soldiers disabled in combat. So I am hoping to change that and off to hopefully get a PhD and pioneer the field of Japanese American disability history. So thank you all for coming and listening to my presentation, and I'm really grateful for your support, and I will turn it back to Vinny.
All right. Thank you so much, Selena. That was a fantastic overview. And I know there's so much more information out there that we could have touched on, but it's really fascinating to know just, one more chapter in our history that doesn't really get covered in school in most places. So thank you so much for your hard work. I would like to give everyone a chance to, take care of anything they need to, since we have a long program tonight. So we can take a 5-minute break and regroup here at, 7:45, and then we'll proceed with our panel discussion portion. But thank you. Welcome back, everyone. It's really great to have you here. For those who might have been just joining us or came in a little bit after the introductions, my name is Vinny Taguchi. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the current president of the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. So now that we've had a very exciting and interesting presentation by Selena Moon, we're going to move on to the panel discussion portion of our program. So as a couple of bookkeeping things, the way we have it set up for the recording, you will be visible if you have your camera on, but you won't be visible at all if you have your camera off. So that'll be up to you. We'll keep the focus on our panelists and interpreters. And please feel free at any point to put questions in the chat. We've already had a few floating around, which is good to see. And Karen Tani, who is our moderator, will be directing from there. Our panelists tonight will include Atsuko Kuwana, who was mentioned in Selena's presentation. Chuck Aoki would have been one of our panelists. Unfortunately for us, exciting for him, he is dining at the Vice President's residence tonight in observation of the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So he's going to be represented tonight by his father, Andrew Aoki. And Karen Tani is serving as our moderator, but I also hope that she'll be willing to share some of her experiences as well, because she's doing some very exciting research on this topic. So I'll go ahead and read Karen's bio, and then I'll hand it over to you, Karen. So Karen Tani is the Seaman Family University professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where she holds appointments in the law school and the Department of History. She is the author of States of Dependency, Welfare Rights, and American Governance, 1935 to 1972, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. She is currently working on a book on disability law and policy in the late 20th century. So perfect expert to moderate our panel tonight. So all yours, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you. Vinny, did you also want to read the bios for the other panelists, or should we let that sort of come out organically as they're speaking?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So let's see. First, I have Atsuko Kuwana, who lives in Honolulu, Hawaii, and was born in Fukushima, Japan. Atsuko's disability is a spinal cord injury since birth, and she uses a wheelchair. When Atsuko was working as an intern at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley in the early 80s, she learned that it is important for people with disabilities to live independently and change society. Atsuko is currently working as a Japanese language teacher and a translator. And then I can go ahead and read Chuck's bio as well, just so we know all about him. Chuck Aoki is originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and has used a wheelchair since the age of 10 due to a rare genetic condition. Chuck is a 3-time US Paralympic medalist in the sport of wheelchair rugby and has been involved in adaptive sports for his entire life. Currently, Chuck works as a community access navigator at the University of Michigan, where he oversees their Prescription to Play grants program, intended to increase access to sports and fitness opportunities for people living with SCIs. And his father, Andy Aoki, is a professor of political science at Augsburg University. He teaches courses on American politics and has published work on immigration, Asian American and ethno-racial politics, multicultural education, and popular culture and politics. He is currently working on a study of the different ways that racial categories were created in the United States. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I first want to say a big thanks to Selena Moon for this fantastic, eye-opening research, which I think is truly original and really exciting. I'm also really excited to share the Zoom stage with these fantastic panelists. I thought I would begin with a sort of open-ended question that would invite the panelists to say a little bit more about their personal backgrounds and how they connect to the themes of Selena's presentation. So I'll direct this first at Atsuko and then at Andy. So could you tell the audience a bit about how you see yourself relating first to disability and the movement for disability justice? Second, how do you see yourself relating to the idea of Japanese or Japanese American identity? And is that identity significant to how you think about disability? So here I'm trying to bring together, again, the themes of Selena's research in your own personal lives. So again, this is very open-ended and just meant to get you to tell us more about your stories and the intersections with the research. So Atsuko, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for everybody, and particularly Selena, thank you very much for inviting me this very special opportunity on a special day, because today is, as you know, in Americans with the Disabilities Act was born 1990, and I witnessed that when the president signed the White House, the garden, and I was so excited to be able to at the place with tons of disabled people and supporters and communities. Even though I remember that one of the military person passed away because, passed down, doesn't mean not passed away, they just fainted because it's so hot day in Washington, D.C. So anyway, when I heard this, the Selena presentation, I started remembering, and especially the famous picture with the Justin Dutz and present. And another thing, today was my special days because a year later, July 26, 1991 is my son's birthday. So we adopted him from Japan. But of course, we adopted for so many reasons, but when we saw my husband, Michael, and I saw that his information, the first thing was his birthday, July 26, 1991. So we were, both Mike and I said, this is it. This is our baby. This means something. So anyway, today was a very, very special day for me for both reasons. But anyway, again, my name is Atsuko Kuwana, and I live in Honolulu, Hawaii right now. But I originally came from Japan about 40 years ago. To first, the main reason first time was I was a scholarship intern at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. Then I was there about nearly 1 year, 9 months, to study what independent living movement was. Before I came to Berkeley, I had no clue what the independent living movement. Well, of course, because I'm disabled since I was born, so my parents, my teachers, most of the adults, when I was little, always told me, be independent, be independent. You know, that's why you have to study hard. That's why you work hard. So, but what they meant was, don't bother other people, don't be burdened with other people. So just be quiet, and just do yourself, do everything by yourself. And basically, don't be dependent on so much to the people, community. And then, so that was my meaning of the independent as a disabled person, just get an education, get a work, and no support, no help, just do everyday life by myself. And nothing about philosophical thing or nothing, just more like a physical thing, I think. So then when I had an opportunity to be an intern at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, I learned totally different meaning of independent living, which it was, there's so many incidents because I was surrounded by the great disabled leaders at that time. That was the early 80s. So like, I don't know, Judy Heumann or Ada Roberts, and there's so many disabled celebrities. And I was so fortunate to get to know them, personally. And Judy's still my good friend. And then I met my husband, Michael Winter. He was one of the leader. And I don't know, somebody saw the picture or video. He was one of the person climb up the steps on the Capitol right before the ADA signed. So that was a kind of a demonstration to pass the ADA law. So anyway, those people very, very. That was a very excited moment for my life, and my perspective of disability or my life itself changed totally, upside down, because just as I said, I grew up in a very segregated situation. I was in an institution for 5 years, and I went to a special school for 12 years. Then finally, I started being in mainstreaming. When mainstreaming was, I was 18 years old. So I graduated, special school. Then I started going to 2 years junior college in Japan. That was my first mainstreaming experience. So still with the non-disabled people, I was very awkward. I didn't know even how to talk to them. I didn't know how to react them. So because I didn't have any confidence. And also I always thought, well, I'm a burden. I was a burden for everybody. I was a burden for the community. So for that kind of situation, it's so hard to, grow self-respect and self-confidence. So anyway, but still, at the same time, I noticed something, this is not the right thing when I was in Japan. I faced discrimination almost every day, but I didn't even realize that was a discrimination at that time because that was so common and nobody say anything. And I just have to accept, or I have this kind of experience because I'm disabled. I have this, they discriminate against me because I can't walk. So I always self-blamed. So, but I still knew that something wrong. This is not right. So, but I didn't know what's the solution. So when I moved to Berkeley as an intern, and I was surrounded by leaders every single day. And actually one of the incident which made my, thought totally change upside down was this one disabled person, he was kind of lecturing us. So anyway, what he said at that time, that the society, we have to change the society. We don't need to, disabled people, we don't need to change ourselves. We can be ourselves. And there's a discrimination in the community, no accessibility, no transportation, no job available, no housing. That's not for our fault. That's society's fault. This community's fault, maybe this law's fault. So I was like, wow. So that was the first moment I thought, well, I guess that was the answer I was looking for. I didn't know what was, as I said, I thought something wrong when I was in Japan, but I was not clear because nobody told me. But in Berkeley, this person told me that society have to change, not us. We don't need to change at all. So what a relief. I felt like, wow, so then I can be myself. Great. So anyway, that was, the first, my turning point of my life. But at the same time, since I was in Berkeley, there's so many multicultural, multiracial, there's so many different kind of people. Then, I get involved with the disabled community. I get involved with the women's community. I get involved with the, Asian American or Japanese American community, because those are my identity. But every time I went to different community, I always felt, oh, I'm not part of it. Because if I go to the, women's, group, not many disabled women. And when I went to disabled community, I didn't see so many racial minority disabled people, especially Asian American people, zero. And then when I went to like Asian community or Japanese American community, they talk about their racism, but there's nothing about disableism. And one time I went to the Day of the Remembrance Day, February in San Francisco, Japantown. Somebody invited me, my husband, I went to there. Then we were so excited because I thought we were part of it. But the place was not accessible. And they didn't even realize it until we told them. So I was always wondering, what happened? Some people who are very, very sensitive about discrimination or ism, but they cannot, they focus on racism, but they cannot, they have no idea about other, ism. So I always felt like, I don't know, I'm just outside. I never felt like I'm a kind of part of it. So that's why, like, when I, had Selena's presentation today, because that was my, I always wondering, there must be disabled people with, the Asian American disabled people in this community, in this country, but, I don't know. I don't know the history. No one told me. So, and now I know it's a very, very difficult to research and a very, very limited resource, but somebody did it, which is Selena. So I really appreciate, and I hope now the younger generation are more interested in this multi, issues, not only one single issues. So then the research or understanding, and then and unfortunately I live in Hawaii. So there's so many Asian people. Finally, I feel like I'm a, no minority, I'm a majority. And also at the same time, I see, of course, disabled people, Asian disabled people here. But because Hawaii is a wonderful place and tons of Asian culture. But because of Asian culture, I think that being disabled or, family member with a disability is a little bit, I guess, shame, or, they want to hide it. I guess I heard that still happen in this, community even nowadays. So, I hope this kind of a thing change. I can see I've been here 7 years, so I can see that little by little. So hopefully going toward forward, not backward. So that's my thoughts. So, but anyway, again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Andy, let's hear your response to that question. So again, it was about how you see your personal experiences relating to the themes of Selena's research.
Sure. Well, first, as others did, I really want to thank Selena for the wonderful presentation. It's really great that you're doing this work, and hopefully you'll get some things out in print that I can use in some of my other work. So I have self-interest here too, but it really was great and eye-opening for me. And then the second thing I did want to say is Chuck is very sorry he couldn't be here. As Vinny said, he was invited just last week to go to the vice president's residence, and he thought he shouldn't pass that up. So, but he really is sorry he couldn't make it. He sends his apologies. And I give you my apologies too, if you have a second best. Chuck would have a lot to say about this. And so I'll just preface my remarks by saying I'm going to try and give you a little what I think would be his thoughts too, because he really has thought a lot about some of these topics. He's a blogger for the International Paralympic Committee. I've actually used some of his blogs in my classes because I think they're very thought-provoking. So I'm going to try and give you some of that too. But to start with my own interaction with this, I really start from the race side as a Japanese American. When I grew up, and I know there's some people in the audience who know this experience, racism was thick around me. I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. And there were constant reminders of the bitterness, hostility from World War II. It was in the air, around me, all over my neighborhood. And so I really approached from that. I start from that perspective. I've taught about race. I teach a little about disability. And so that really was how I framed it or how I understood it. And I started to realize, wow, there's a lot of similarities here. There certainly are differences, but it really was an eye-opener. I realized, a lot of folks with disabilities are facing the same kinds of challenges that people in racial minority groups did. And so that's how I approach it. And then Chuck, of course, has a disability. As Vinny said, it's very rare. It's a sensory neuropathy to make it easier for the ASL interpreters. I won't go into all the technical details, but he was born with it. But it's kind of an invisible one. And so we weren't actually aware of it until he was 18 months. And then we started learning more. And then it contributed to other things, which eventually resulted in using a wheelchair full time by the time he was 10. But in a sense, he was a little bit of an example of what they say, someone who kind of joined the disability world. And so from my perspective, it was a different kind of encounter. And I saw some of the things that Atsuko talked about, but also, Chuck was born in 1991. And so I saw some differences. And I think one thing I really want to say is I think the benefits of those who fought for ADA and fought for the other things, I really saw them. We really saw them by the time Chuck was going to school. I think it made a world of difference. He was at a school that was, I think, aware of these issues, but the law made a big difference, I think. And when we would talk to the principal, I think that made a difference. The principal, I think, was very understanding, but he realized there is a legal obligation to provide equal, fair, and adequate education. And so for those who battled for that and struggled, I think it's really made a huge difference. And I see that in Chuck's life. Chuck, I think, would identify more with the disability community and less on the Japanese American side, in part because he went to a very diverse school. And so the racial difference issue really was not an issue. But for him, he's talked about how he struggled where he fit in, because the side of a disabled person, a school, which of course was overwhelmingly able-bodied students, while he had some good friends, he had some good experiences. People who are disabled know on a day-to-day basis, it just makes a huge difference. There are times that literally he could get left behind. And so for him, that was really what shaped his understanding. And he's talked about how it wasn't until he reached this elite level of athletics, or really athletics in general, that he began to feel like he had a place. In Minneapolis, as many of you know, we're lucky to have the Courage Center, which provides wonderful opportunities for youth with disabilities. They have a youth sports program. And not just Chuck, but others of his friends I heard talk about how they really loved going there because they felt like they had a community. They felt like they were among other people where they fit in. They did stand out as someone different. And I think that was the case for Chuck too. And so he really comes at this from the disability perspective, different direction I come at it. But he has been, I think, quite active in different ways, in his own way, and mentoring people. And he's now a role model for a lot of aspiring kids with disabilities. I just came from a tournament in Birmingham, and it was moving to me to see. I talked to a few parents who came up because he's quite well known now, and they said, "Oh yeah, we bring our kids here." One said, "Our son has a disability, and he didn't want to do anything. Then he saw these athletes, and he just loved it. He wanted to go see it. So when we found out they're in town, he wanted to go see them play." And then there was another kid who wanted his picture taken with Chuck, and so he is carving out his own path, of course, but he's very aware of the continuing struggle. He wrote a really thought-provoking and to be poignant blog about how the wheelchair is part of his identity. And he said, sometimes people say, "I forget you're in a wheelchair." And he said, "Well, I understand that's well-intentioned, but that's part of me. You're saying you're forgetting part of who I am." And I have to say, he's taught me a lot. I've learned a lot from his really thoughtful ways of thinking and writing about this. So I come at this from one perspective. Chuck comes at it from another perspective. One thing that ties this together, I think, is that as I said, the hard work that the pioneers, some of you out there, did with things like the ADA, did make such a difference. So he had some advantages that people who came before him did not, but he still faced these struggles that I hear Selena talk about. That shot, I think it was maybe from Tule Lake, the girl writing about her experiences. I looked very closely. She said she felt very isolated, and it really struck a chord with me. And I thought of things that Chuck talked about too. So I just feel a lot of things that resonate here, and I really appreciate the work you've done, Selena.
Selena, I want to give you a chance to respond to what you heard before we move on. So what are your reactions to what you've heard from the panelists so far?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for all of your kind words and for coming and talking to all of us. It's wonderful to learn more about your background, and I wish we could, call in the VP and say hi, but we can't do that. So I come at this as somebody who was born visually impaired, but I didn't really understand that. I grew up in the US for about 9 years and then moved to my mother's hometown in Japan, and then came back here a couple of years later. And I didn't really need accommodations until I came back to the US because of how the schools in Japan were at the time. And I didn't really realize that I was disabled until I was standing in the back of the classroom in Japan and went, "Oh, people can stand all the way back here and see the whiteboard." It just never occurred to me that, I couldn't see things that other people could. Japan stereotypically doesn't do disability very well. But interestingly, when I was in school in Japan, there was a class of mostly children with mental disabilities who each grade would take care of the children in their respective grades, bring them to presentations and things like that. When we learned to sing, and I don't know the English word for this, but sort of the hand motions that you do, the dancing that you do when you sing, was actually Japanese Sign Language. And I didn't realize that until, a bit into this. So I was surrounded by disability and accommodations and things like that without really understanding that's what that was. And then, of course, I was born, not too long before the ADA was signed. So I don't remember a time before that. And of course, would not have appreciated the struggles that everybody went through. And so, yes, I had things like the ADA, but my biggest problem was the teachers getting so irritated at having to provide those accommodations when I came back to the States, all through middle school, high school, and what a burden they seemed to see it as. And so it wasn't until I got to college and finally, my professors were tripping over themselves saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to enlarge this," or "I'm sorry, I forgot to do X, Y, and Z." And it was just going, wow, this is a complete 180 from, what I'm used to. And so, as others have said, I just wish that we were so far along. You know, there was so much more that needs to be done that just, I wish we didn't have to struggle so much. And I'm so grateful for everybody's work. And, you know, having people like Chuck to have kids who can look up and say, I can do that. You know, somebody who looks like me, has a disability like me, can do something like that. So I can do that too, has been really, really inspirational.
For my next question, I wanted to just first recognize the originality of what Selena is doing. I don't really know of other scholars who are working at the intersection of disability history and Asian American history. And so I think in that spirit, in the sense that this is a wide open field, I wanted to ask the panelists whether, imagine that we had a cohort of other people joining Selena in this work. Are there episodes from history that you wish that people knew about or that people would pay more attention to? I'm thinking specifically about, again, this intersection of disability and Japanese American identity, but you could take this question in any direction that you want. So the idea again is, you know, what do you wish the broader public knew about the past that you imagine a researcher like Selena could uncover? Atsuko, I'll ask this to you first, and then we can hear from Andy. I think you're muted again.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Well, it's hard to answer. I have to think about it. So, God. What do you expect? I have no idea.
Well, I think one thing that you said that really struck me was about the way that we remember the disability rights movement and the community of people that we imagine produced landmark legislation. And I think part of what you were saying in your remarks was about the exclusions that were intentionally or unintentionally part of that time period as well. So that's just one idea. But I think, again, like something about your personal story to me really transforms the way that I think about the history that I learned from the books that do exist.
Well, oh God. Could you ask other person? I have to think about it.
Sure. Andy, do you have thoughts about this? We could also, I'm sure Selena has ideas about other things that were not in the presentation that she could talk about as well.
Yeah, I have to admit, whenever I'm hearing, really informative presentation like Selena's, I think of, a book about every 5 minutes. There are so many great things that, she touched on. I thought, boy, I'd like to know more about that. So that's really what I was thinking. So for instance, just take one example. She discussed, the role of Japanese American elected officials there. And I thought, well, how did they experience this? Because of course, as other people mentioned, there was a period of time when there's a strong push to hide it, to be quote unquote normal. How did they see themselves? Did they embrace this? Did they try and hide it as much as they could? So that's one thing that really came to my mind. And of course, there are what we call visible disabilities and invisible disabilities, and some, like Inoue, he couldn't hide, his, but you wonder if other Japanese Americans who can't hide the fact they're Japanese, if they're trying to hide that, or if maybe that makes them more willing to embrace that identity. So that's one of the things that I would be fascinated by, and Selena's really helped open my eyes, to this range of people who did have disabilities, and you don't hear much. I mean, some of course we heard about, but others you just don't hear much about. So that's one thing I would love to see. Some future grad student looking for a great dissertation topic pursue that.
Selena, are there other topics that you didn't put into the presentation, but you're just dying to have some fellow traveler explore?
Well, I'm loath to share what I'm doing. I'm getting a little possessive. On the other hand, I'm going to need a lot of help to do what I'm doing because I can't Well, I can't drive. So it's not like I can go to all these places that have all these records, even without COVID and anti-Asian racism and so on. So there's that. So this has been a lot harder than I anticipated. But disability history really is only just starting to do its intersectionalities, LGBT, feminism, race, all of that. And so that's just coming to the forefront. So I think it's, new fields are opening up every day, and there are people doing it. Kim Nielsen's A Disability History of the United States, NIELSEN, talks about Black Americans, Native Americans, a little bit about Asian Americans. So I'm touching off of that as I write. But even as I'm basically doing my PhD comps research reading, several years in advance once I figured out this is what I wanted to do. But there's really no minority in disability. So all of that just needs to come out into the open. And, a lot of the research I'm doing on Japanese American mixed race history, everybody keeps talking about, we need to talk more about more than just white Japanese families, more than just certain families. We need to diversify the narrative. And I keep hearing that over and over, but nobody's willing to take that up, really. So far, unfortunately, it's mostly been lip service. So we've got, I think, a long way to go in the Asian American community to diversify everything, and vice versa with disability community. So, and I could talk on and on about all kinds of other people who made contributions over the firsts that I unfortunately don't have time to do. I'll write all about this, in another 40 years, or however long it takes me to figure all this out. But just all of that needs to come out as well.
Atsuko, does that spur any further thoughts for you? I can also
now, yeah. Okay. So, I think everybody's become disabled sooner or later. To me, all elderly people, like for example, my mother, I don't think she's disabled, but to me, my point of view, she's totally disabled. She forgets everything easily. She walks slowly, physically, she's 80 some years old. So disability issues should be always in, any kind of a social issue, race, gender, or, anything, but always lack of disability, the part, like even women's study. Of course, there's a disabled woman. Asian American studies, there's a disabled Asian American. So when I was young, I took courses, those classes in a college. And whenever I have to write paper, my thought, always my perspective, because I'm Asian, I'm Japanese, I'm a woman. So, but I don't think many people got it. To me, same level, discrimination, prejudice, same level, always. Being disabled, being women, maybe now I'm getting old, so age. So the race, but I always get frustrated because people don't see that. I think they don't want to think about it because they're so afraid of being disabled. Because in this world, disabled still, even though no matter how many leaders or athletes, they praise them, like the non-disabled people, community non-disabled people, praise them. Disabled people do something great. Oh, that's great. They overcome their hardship. So they see us something kind of model minority type of the people if we do something good. So, but we are not anything. We're just a part of the community. We're part of this, this country. So I want to see that, that's why I really appreciate Selena's studies. So finally, Selena focused on that part, that not only disability, not only race. So eventually this may be the, gender may be issue, it can be. So anyway, I wish, I don't want people to afraid of speak about disability. So I think those kind of fear, I want, any kind of situation, college level or school education work, in a society, I wanna always, being disabled, it's nothing wrong. It's not be scared of, The scary thing is a society, because society might be not ready for us. So it's not disabled people are not scared. And I wanted them to, feel that being disabled is not so bad, So that's yeah.
I think that's a great perspective, and it resonates with something that someone mentioned in the chat about the malleability of the concept of disability, and how it could be that today during a pandemic, people who are immunocompromised might feel more disabled because society is not, in essence, accommodating their situation. This transitions nicely to a question that I wanted to pose to the panel that is about terms and terms like disability. Before I ask that question, I just want to invite the audience, if you have questions, feel free to, you can raise your electronic hand. There's an icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen that allows you to raise your hand, and I'll be able to see that and call on you if you have a question. Another way to ask a question would be to type it into the chat. Depending on the nature of the question, I may or may not pose it to the group, but that's a good way to chime into the discussion, and then we can see what everyone is interested in talking about for the remainder of the time. So the question that I wanted to pose now before turning to audience questions is about these terms that I might describe as kind of umbrella terms. They're capacious terms. So disabled people is a big term, and it contains a lot of diversity. People with physical impairments, people with mental impairments. We talked about hidden disabilities versus more visible disabilities. A lot of things can go under that umbrella. Likewise, and this resonates with, I think, Andy's research, Asian Americans is a big term containing a lot of diversity. Even the term Japanese Americans is in some sense a big term if we think about the experience of someone who is an immigrant versus the experience of someone like me, who is, Japanese American by heritage, but is significantly removed from the immigrant experience. Yet, right, I could call myself Japanese American in the same way that a recent immigrant could. So the question I wanted to pose to the panelists and also to Selena is, do you find these terms useful? Do you use these terms? Do you find these terms problematic? Any thoughts that you have about the kind of language that we use to talk about these experiences? Maybe I'll ask Andy to go first here, since I know this fits so much with your research.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've actually written a little on this, and have had spirited but civil debates with colleagues about whether Asian American is a meaningful term. I think my answer is the Weasley, it depends. And the same goes for disability too. When you're trying to effect political change, numbers matter. And the more people you can bring together, the better your chance of success. And these umbrella terms like Asian American or Japanese American or disabled, that does provide a potentially common identity, and that can be very useful. But yeah, in other circumstances, there is enormous diversity. I know Chuck has written on this a little bit. He said, it's ridiculous. You shouldn't have to be a para-Olympian, to be recognized for certain things. And there's a huge range of conditions, and obviously the disability community maybe is bigger than any of these groups. And there is a risk, when you use those umbrella terms, that sometimes small groups get overlooked. I know that happens, of course, with Asian Americans. Some Asian American subgroups feel that it's too East Asian. And again, it's a weaselly answer, but I think it depends. I think there are times I believe it's useful, but there are other times we really do need to be aware of that enormous diversity there. And I know with disability, it's difficult for me to keep track in the full range, along with, as you mentioned, Karen, the malleable nature of that. Sometimes it might not seem like a disability, other times very much is.
Atsuko, do you have thoughts about this, either about the term disabled people or the term Asian Americans or even Japanese Americans, the utility or maybe the problems that those terms carry?
Well, I don't think there's any good term for disabled people with disabilities. Even disability is, the image is, something negative, right? The English, I'm not native, English speaker, but I think this, this. So anyway, and some people call another extreme is like a challenger, or what's that, challenge, So I'm not challenging nothing, I'm just living myself. So I, to me right now is nothing's good. But among them, maybe people with a disability or people of color or women of color or women with a disability. So something, the disability is coming with us, not disability, it's a part of my identity. But it's, when I was in Japan, I was like a young, until early 20s, they always see me as a disabled at the first. Not like that time I was a girl, or obviously Japanese, it's only mainly Japanese people. But anyway, but when I moved to US, I noticed that people treated me Atsuko. Then Atsuko happened to be disabled, Atsuko happened to be women, Atsuko happened to be Japanese. So I really like that feeling that me, the person first. So, but I don't know how to call those things, maybe there's no such thing, but I really, I want people to think, please look at me, maybe I'm a bad person, I'm a good person, but don't look at me, I know I'm in a wheelchair, so it's, that's the first thing they catch. But that's not that I just happen to be sitting in a wheelchair because I can't walk, but it's nothing wrong. That's just part of it. So, please you don't need to feel bad, or you don't need to feel sorry for me, or just like so for me, more term is just term. We need that term to describe, but I really, including myself, I want to, people to, see that what he or she is, not, who she is or who he is, not what they look like or what they cannot do, that kind of thing. So to me, term is just for practical reason. So that's how I think, yeah.
Thank you for those reflections. Selena, as I direct this question to you, I wondered if you wanted to tell the group a little bit more historically about these terms. So one thing I really liked about your presentation is you were very specific about the particular impairments or disabilities that you were talking about. And I think that was in part your way of acknowledging that people didn't necessarily think about themselves according to this disabled people category that we use today. And that, as Andy and Atsuko said, is in part a legacy of a sort of political movement to bring people together. And in other eras, maybe it was more common to organize in kind of more impairment specific or disease specific ways. So I wondered if you again want to say a little bit more about the history of these terms and then offer your own reflections on the utility of these umbrella categories, whether it is a term like disabled or a term like Asian American.
So I really don't have an issue with the term disabled. I know that I am disabled. There are things I can't do and never will be able to do I mean, hopefully one day I'll be able to drive because there'll be self-driving cars, that kind of thing. But, euphemisms, I think, are what I have more of a problem with, things like differently abled, things like that just try to make, and sorry, I'm not trying to dump on the non-disabled community here, but, to make the non-disabled community kind of feel better about people with disabilities, and a lot of what I was finding as I was doing the research, and I'm actually writing a book chapter about this, was a lot of the difficulty I had in finding my sources was because the terminology that I needed to use to look up my sources were very outdated, offensive terms that I'm finding. So a lot of, for example, the War Relocation Authority records use a lot of terms like handicapped and other problematic terms that I had to use. So things like that I never really thought about in terms of how to find what I needed to do. I mean, even family members of the people with disabilities I was looking at would use those terms even, into like the 90s. And they're just not something I think that they really thought of. But the other thing too that I'm also finding is that it's only certain disabilities, usually physical, that get talked about. People with mental disabilities are usually talked about by family members because in many cases they can't speak for themselves or, won't because they're, they just aren't given the opportunity. But there's a lot of things, even, for example, I took sign language in high school, and the deaf community, that is deaf with a capital D, to be part of the deaf community, not just audiologically deaf, doesn't necessarily see themselves as disabled. And that was something that I hadn't considered. As I said, I'm visually impaired, so I've never not thought of myself as disabled. So things like that I had to learn about how other people saw themselves, even if I saw them as disabled, or people who think if they've got multiple disabilities are more thinking more about one disability over the other, identifying more with one or the other, and things like that, and sort of how they can fit into one community but not the other. There's really not a lot of intersectionality if you've got multiple disabilities, because that community is pretty small. But other than that, things like terminology, the issue of hyphenating Japanese American, African American is not something I thought of until recently. A lot of my Twitter feed incidentally talks a lot about why the hyphen is bad and how it sort of otherizes everybody. And that's something I've had to learn to change in my writing, is taking out the hyphen, for example. And I've started hopefully getting a lot better at calling out people for using, outdated, offensive terminology that people don't necessarily think of as outdated and offensive. And I'm still learning a lot on that score, and I've probably still got a lot to learn too.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections. I'll also add that part of the reason that I asked that question is because, as you know from your research, and as Atsuko mentioned, there are certain people that seem to be, you just said, kind of at the forefront of speaking for people with disabilities. And one thing I've noticed in my research is that in some organizing spaces, it almost seems like there are kind of hierarchies of disabilities that aren't necessarily discussed, and so to give an example, some of the people who are most well remembered in disability history would be people who were wheelchair users, but, mentally completely brilliant. Often they were white, articulate, good looking, conventionally attractive people. So that's something that I wanted to put on the table. Andy, if I could ask you to channel Chuck for a minute, I wonder if this is something that you have spoken about with him. So in a kind of pre-conversation, we talked about how he is part of this subculture within the disability community that is athletic, is able to do these really physical kind of things that society tends to admire, really kind of macho sort of sports. And does that put him kind of in a privileged position within the disability community? So does he have thoughts about that? Have you talked about that?
Not a lot. I mean, I think he is very aware of that. I don't know, the full extent that you described it, but he's very aware. Obviously just his specific personal physical situation puts him in a place that not everyone is. Is because of his life and what he's done, he certainly has met a lot of other people in other circumstances. And so he knows that in one sense, he's in a privileged position within the disability position. I think in that one link I posted his blog, he actually addresses that briefly. Practically speaking, he kind of works where he is, and so the lobbying and things he's done has been for the kinds of things he's doing. But I do think that he's very aware. He's thought a lot about disability and the place of disability in America, at least, and how people are in very different positions, and that the term disability in some ways is too broad, and yes, certain types bubble up. I mean, the other thing that what came by me, you're saying Stephen Hawking. People always talk about Stephen Hawking, and these incredibly brilliant people are certainly impressive, but that's not really representative of the broader range of that population.
I don't see too many audience hands right now, so I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask another question. This one is coming from my background in law. So as Vinny mentioned, I'm a law professor and also a historian. And one thing that I have thought about a lot, both with respect to Asian American identity and disability, is this idea that you have really important laws on the books which ostensibly protect people's civil rights and say that people from these minority or marginalized groups are full citizens included in the polity. And yet I think we have a lot of present day experience that's not totally the case. So I'm thinking, for example, about hate crimes against Asian Americans, which we've seen in abundance during the COVID pandemic. I'm thinking also about non-enforcement or under-enforcement of laws, such as the ADA that Atsuko mentioned. So for the panelists, I wondered if you have particular reflections. These could be personal reflections or not personal, about our legal system, and the extent to which it is helpful in the movements for racial justice or disability justice, or the ways that maybe it is not yet as helpful as it could be. I know that's a big question. Atsuko, I'll start with you and see if you have any thoughts about that, since you did bring up the ADA and this important anniversary, and then I'll turn to the others.
Well, I really, really believe that law is very important, especially particularly this country, such a the civil rights movement is a big part of this country, and I'm very proud of it. And that's the reason I really like this country, because there's no such thing in Japan, unfortunately. I mean, I don't think most of the people, Japanese people, and they say that the rights, the human rights or the rights, but I don't think, I mean, their meaning of the rights and the US meaning of the rights is a totally different thing. So, but here, not only disabled people with a disability, any kind of women, racial minority, any kind of people are protected by law. Maybe not perfect, but at least there is a law. That's why ADA is very, very important, because before the ADA, we couldn't do anything, even though there's a real discrimination against the disabled people, but we couldn't go anywhere. We couldn't, because there's no law. That's not, we cannot say, oh, you're against law, but they just ignore. They just go, like I remember that my husband, when he said he was young, he trying to go to the restaurant. I think it's a Chinese restaurant actually. So there's such a, I mean, to me, few decades ago, particularly just Asian people, Asian American people, such a narrow mind, or maybe culturally they don't want to talk about disabled. They don't want to even see it. So when my husband showed up, they said, oh, you cannot allow, you cannot come to this restaurant. Well, obviously, it's like this happened maybe 70s or early 80s before ADA. So of course that's a wrong, but because there's no protection for us. So we're getting angry, we're getting frustrated, but we couldn't deal with more, the legal way. So that's why to me, ADA is, I feel like I'm protected by ADA. And I feel like I am a not second citizen anymore. I am a part of the community. And I have a right to open my mouth, then to say something, then to, it's not complain. It's like appeal my rights. So people say, oh, disabled people complain, but that's, if we have a law, when we have a law, that's not complaint. That's a complaint, but we're not like a little kid. We were saying our rights. Then if that's a law, then the judge, hopefully good judge, but judge decide who's right, who's wrong. So then my husband, unfortunately had a lawsuit a few times, which was very good experience. And it's very clear, few of them, we didn't make lots of money, but at least we show that we are not right, we are not wrong. We just say, our right. Then judge decide, oh yeah, because according to this law, housing law, ADA law, so this person appeal is right, and they have the right to say it, then the right to correct the situation. So the biggest reason I decided to live in the States, not in Japan, because it's a law. That's for sure.
Andy, what are your thoughts on this?
I have a lot of similar thoughts, I think, to Atsuko. I think the laws do make a big difference. They're not enough, but I think to a predecessor landmark law before ADA, which now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, for kids, it just boggles my mind that public schools could turn away kids with disabilities before that, saying, well, we don't want to educate you. I can't tell how appalled I was when I learned about that. And that, things like that, I think, have made a huge difference. They aren't enough. I see this as a bystander, but because Chuck has traveled a lot for sports when he was youth, and I talked to the families of things like hotel room accessibility, bathroom accessibility. It's just not. My kid had to crawl to the door because they couldn't get their wheelchair in there. So I know it's not enough, but at the same time, as Atsuko said, it's a powerful tool. And I think it has made a big difference. And as I've said before, the people who fought for this, I'm internally grateful, for what they did. I think they made a very large difference in many people's lives.
Selena, do you have thoughts about this question about law and the legal system?
I actually just talked to a friend, and she posted the interview that she did with me. And, part of that was, if disabled people ran the world, things would be so much better. We'd have things like self-driving cars already, and things like ASL interpreting, and captions would be automatic, and captions would actually be worth it. They'd actually work instead of the half the time gibberish that you get, and things like that. We wouldn't have to be arguing about the ADA says you have to do this. It would just get done, and we'd have so much more. We'd have, just everything would be accessible, whether it's historic sites, schools, just everything. So one day, hopefully, we'll get there, but we're not there yet. Yes, we're a lot better than Japan. On the other hand, Japan has a lot better public transit. I have to be very careful about where I live because public transit, say for where I am right now in Minnesota, there's a bus that goes by my house, the last one at 7:45 in the morning. If I miss that, then I have to walk 2 miles down the street to catch the bus. And the last one that leaves from there to get to Minneapolis leaves about 8:30 in the morning. And, the last bus out of Minneapolis to get anywhere near my house is at 6 o'clock. So either I spend 3 hours commuting to work or, and pay very little money because there's thankfully discounts for disabled people on public transit, or spend an entire day's wage Ubering back and forth to work. And that's just not sustainable. And you've got all kinds of things about, and I don't know very much about this, but limits on Social Security income for disabled people, people being prohibited from getting married because then they have to file income jointly and all kinds of other things that just are mind-boggling to me that still exist. We tax Social Security, for God's sake, just all kinds of things that, again, if disabled people ran the world, we would be in a much better position. And FYI, if my power goes out, we're in the middle of a thunderstorm. So if I disappear, that's why. So hopefully one day we'll get there and not have to have able-bodied people who don't know about disability sort of guessing at the accommodations that we need, or us having to ask. Everything will automatically be there. It'll be easy, simple, and just part of the regular framework.
We're approaching time, but Selena, I'm going to try to sneak in one more question for you before your power goes out and before we close things out, and then I'll hand it back to Vinny. But the question for you is one that I think about a lot and get asked a lot as a historian, which is, what is this history good for? What is its utility in the present? So as you're doing this research, what would you say to someone that says to you, what is this for? What is its usefulness in our present moment?
Well, first I'll start with the personal thing. I finally found my community doing this, because as a mixed race Asian American, I never fit in the US, in Japan. I was always too Asian for the US. I was too American for Japan. And, finally finding Asian American disability, I'm like, wow, people get me finally. They get both sides of me, the Asian American side, the disabled side, the merging thereof. And just so that was a huge relief, I guess, for me to finally find the people who understand all of the struggles they're in. But as I said earlier, the issue of all of these communities coming together, we've excluded minorities in disability research, whether it's LGBT, Asian American, women, the conglomeration thereof. All of these communities have always been excluded. And even things like, other kinds of historical research just really is finally now getting into all of the minority communities that it hasn't before, because it always takes that. It has to be, say, the disability community, and then we go to women, and then we go to LGBT, and then we go to Asian American, African American, so on and so forth. And we finally get to that big, middle of the Venn diagram. And we have to do that for everything, every kind of history, social movement, politics, even, we're not there yet with disability law. We're not there yet with LGBTQ inclusion. We're still really not there with things like the civil rights movement for non-white communities and so on and so forth. So I'm doing this because I have to.
Well, thank you for doing this. I think we all learned a lot, and really, I personally benefited from this conversation so much. It was a privilege to moderate. I'll turn things back over to Vinny. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was an incredible job. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Selena, for heading us off and for sharing your incredible research. I really hope you get the resources you need to put those books out. I think we're all waiting on them excitedly. So hopefully someone sees this and that connection can be made.
I hope so.
And of course, Andy, Atsuko, thank you so much for joining as well and sharing from your experiences. It was really special to hear all these different views on this topic, conversations that obviously aren't had often enough, but to really show the diversity of it, even by just putting 4 people together in a room is incredible. So that's enough out of me. Without further ado, I'll give you all back to your evenings. But thank you so much. And thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library, of course, for hosting us, for providing the technical support, for making this all possible, and our incredible ASL interpreters that have been working tirelessly this entire time.